All right, good morning, everybody. Today it's Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and we have 11 and 12. 12 doesn't take that long. It's really kind of a closing monologue. It always reminds me, chapter 12 is always reminds me of in those movies where the bad guy has to tell the good guy everything that he's going to do right before he kills him. And then, of course, and it's Solomon is kind of like wrapping things up. So 12, we'll see how far we get today. So last week, this is where we left off. When Solomon said, send your bread on the surface of the waters, for after many days you may find it. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you don't know what disaster may happen on earth. This is another parable. When he says, cast your bread, be generous when you can. That way, when you need something, this is the parable of the shrewd manager we talked about last week. Jesus says that when you have something, John the Baptist today, when he says, if you got 2 jackets, if you got some extra food, notice he doesn't say give all your jackets away or give all your food away. He says, when you realize you have more than you need, share. Because then when you have a need, it is more likely that someone will say, we know how generous you are. We heard you need something. We would like to help you. Verse 3. If the clouds are full, they will pour out rain on the earth. Whether a tree falls to the south or the north, the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. Now, let's face it, this is common sense, right? Clouds rain when they're too full to hold on to the water. Trees fall, and they don't think about where they're going to fall. Although a wise man might see the possibility, in other words, when a tree is just about ready to fall, but it's going to fall. And when it falls, it's going to fall where it's going to fall. How many of you, actually don't raise your hands, but once in a while, I'm posting our stuff on YouTube and I see those videos of the guy who's sawing the tree and then the tree falls on the house of the truck. And it's terrible to watch those things, but you just have to, because you see this and you know what's coming. And when the tree falls on the truck and there goes, we're like, we saw that coming. How didn't you see it? And so Solomon is simply saying that when the world is in motion, it's in motion. Verse 4, one who watches the wind will not sow, and the one who looks at the clouds will not reap. Now, please notice he's not saying that you shouldn't look at the clouds and watch the wind. This is very important. Yesterday, I got back about 1 a.m. yesterday morning. We got into San Francisco, and if you didn't hear, another huge storm hit, water everywhere. They even had a tornado watch in the city itself. And, we took off, and it was the pilot actually came out, and this is rare, but he came out and he says, folks, I'm just going to warn you, this is going to be not a bad ride, but it's not going to be a good ride. Seatbelt light is going to be on most of the time. I just want to make you aware of that. For 5 hours and 15 minutes, I'll be honest, the seatbelt lights was on over 4.5 hours. And by the way, there'd be like little 4-minute spaces that we were able to get up. But the pilot comes on, he says, look, I've checked all the winds out. He says, I'm going to do my best. But he says, we're already leaving 2 hours late. But he says, unless you really want a roller coaster, he says, I'm going to have to fly here and there to get around. So when Solomon says, if you watch the wind, you're not going to sow. And he says, you look at the clouds, you're not going to reap. What he's saying is, if that's all you do. I had a dear friend, and he's still a dear friend. And every day he would sit on top. He would go up and take a hike up onto the top of a hill, look down over the town that he lived in and pray for it. But you see, here was the difference. He didn't just go up on the hill and pray for the town. He then went down and tried to become an answer to prayer. But he had people that would go up on the hill with him in the morning, and all they did was pray. And then they couldn't understand why things weren't changing. And he says, it's not God's job. It's ours. God gave us the job to change things. So when we're praying over the town, we should also be thinking, how can I be an agent of change to make sure that things are taking place? Daydreaming is different than learning from the weather. Wisdom is something you apply, not just something you watch or get distracted by. I've got thousands of hours of continuing education credit. mostly because I'm old. But my wife used to say, why do you go to all these things when you never come back and apply it? And I said, how do you know I don't apply it? She says, well, a lot of it doesn't apply. I said, that's absolutely right. But the things that do, and sometimes, by the way, you have to read an entire book to find one quote that makes it all worthwhile. Sometimes you have to go to an entire 3-day conference to find one or two principles. But those one or two principles make a difference. And that's why you don't just watch the clouds and you don't just watch the weather and the wind. You watch and you learn so that you can apply it. And this is what Solomon is all about. Verse 5, just as you don't know the path of the wind or how bones develop in the womb of a pregnant woman, so you don't know the work of God who makes everything. Now, today we would look at this and say, well, actually, Solomon, we actually kind of do know those things today. And Solomon would say, no, you understand the process of watching it develop. But this is one of those wonderful things. When I was in Silicon Valley way back in the 80s, I would talk to these individuals who had multiple doctorates, and they were literally rocket scientists, and they were doing this incredible stuff, and yet they were there every Sunday in worship. And when we would talk about things like creation and all of these mysteries of the universe, with all of their intelligence, they would say, there are things I understand. And he says, there are other things that I want to understand. And the difference between that is, these things, all I can do is say, I see how they are taking place, but I can't necessarily explain it. And this is one of those moments where you begin to realize that when we talk about faith and the church and our life as Christians, I don't always understand why things happen the way they do. But one of the things that I do understand is that whereas I may not make the right choice, I cannot not make a choice. And I have to learn from my mistakes. And so when Solomon says what we see and what we experience and what we are having happen both around us and to us and to others, he says the purpose of this is not to get upset, not to get angry, not to just pull back into ourselves and say there's no hope, but rather to understand. I may not understand why the wind is going this way 1 minute and that way. Every time on Saturday that I am here to sweep the entryway to the church and I get the blower out and I start blowing it because I know which way the wind is going, and just as I get it into a pile, what happens? The wind shifts and goes the other way and puts all the leaves back. And I'd love to tell you that, because once in a while the wind just goes in a direction I don't understand. And so sometimes I get out a broom and I just sweep it up when it's those days when the wind is coming from all four directions seemingly at the same time. Solomon is saying, you listen, you watch, you experience so that you can make sure you do the best that you can. Can't always fix everything. You see, faith, there are things you can know and things you can't. Mysteries can only be held on to by faith. When somebody comes to me and says, why is this happening to me? Sometimes I know. Sometimes it's pretty obvious. But other times, there is no explanation, neither logical, spiritual, or earthly. Sometimes things happen and we can't explain it. And this is where we have to back up and by faith simply say, okay, God, I'm going to just be still. And I'm going to have to let you be God because this is something that I can't handle on my own. And in those moments, by the way, this is why he gives us the community of faith. Because in those moments, somebody else has to hold us up. Somebody else has to hold on to us. Somebody else has to take care of us. I was watching a little kid who had a balloon, and his parents kept saying over and over again, do not let go. And the kid would giggle and laugh. And then I watched the kid, and he would let go, and then he would grab the string, and he would let go, and he would grab the string. And his parents said, don't do that. You're going to lose the balloon. And then one time he let go, and he went to grab it, and he missed. And then he was crying and pointing, and he expected his parents to go find it and get it back for him. Solomon is saying, when you learn something, sometimes consequences happen because we did something. Other times they happen and we can't explain them. And he says we can get mad and upset, but it's not going to do any good. Verse 6. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening do not let your hand rest, because you don't know which will succeed, whether one or the other, or if both of them will be equally good. Sometimes this is where in the New Testament, do not grow weary of doing good. Sometimes we do the right thing, and we do the right thing over and over, and we don't get anything, and those who don't do the right thing seem to be succeeding. And this is where the Bible says we can't grow tired of doing good. The purpose is not to win. Once in a while you hear me talk about Ted Lasso, the show that's on whatever channel it's on. My wife got me into this last year. And Ted Lasso is this coach who is not interested in winning as much as he is in developing the characters. And it's an interesting concept because he gets into this and they keep saying, Coach, you didn't win. He says, it's not about winning. And they're like, no, it's always about winning. He says, no. He says, my job is to develop each of the individuals on this team into the best them that they can be. Once they are developed into the best them that they can be, he says, that's when we'll know whether or not we can win. But he says, winning at the cost, and this is where we would use a biblical term, what good is it if a man gains the whole world but forfeits his soul? What good is it if you win the championship and yet the players on the team self-destruct? Yeah. We see this, and we have to understand that when we do the right thing, the reason we do the right thing is because it's the right thing. It's not to get anything. We do what is right because it is the right thing to do. Galatians 6:10, as we have the opportunity, we should do good. Jesus said, work while it's still light. Because he said the dark's going to come and you're not going to be able to work. And he says, so when the light's out and when you have light, get done everything that you can get done, because too often we say, mañana. And then mañana comes and we don't get everything done. And so Solomon is saying we need to be ready to get done everything we possibly can. Verse 7, light is sweet and it's pleasing for the eyes to see the sun. This Solomon is asking if we have been paying attention. Have we seen the light? Winona Judd sings a song, I Saw the Light. And it's a whole different matter. But there's so many of these old songs that we've seen the light. John Newton, Amazing Grace. When you see the light, when you've been in the darkness, it's painful. As your eyes adjust, you begin to see in this beauty. So I grew up in Denver, Colorado, where all during the winter it snows. But if it snows today, tomorrow it'll be 70 and the snow will melt. Blue skies, and it's just Colorado. It's why so many people want to live there. So when my wife and I went to Fort Wayne, where I was going to go to seminary, during the entire winter, if you've ever lived in Fort Wayne, the sky is this white color. It's this grayish white. And you never really see blue. So the very first Christmas, we came back and we were driving our little 1978 Dodge Omni, and we pull up to my parents' house, and Nancy and I get out of the car, and my parents are rushing out to see us, and my wife and I get out, and we're staring at the sky. And they're going, what's the matter? We go, it's blue. And my parents are like, yeah, it's always been blue. And we had to explain to them, okay, turns out in Indiana, the sky is kind of this grayish white. And they looked at us like, okay, you've been driving for 24 hours. Maybe you need to eat and drink something. We're like, no. We'll take some pictures and send it to you. But you see, this is what he's saying. Have we seen the light? And do we understand the difference between the light and the darkness? Because when we understand the difference, it allows us to step back and say, now what do we do? Verse 8, indeed, if a man lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. And let him remember the days of darkness, since they will be many, because all that comes is futile. This is where I'm going to ask again. What's on your bucket list? What are the must-do things in your life? How will you measure your personal success? Because if your success is going to be measured by money, wealth, power, influence, the day you die, all of that is wiped out. They might name a building after you, but if you've been down to Chinatown here in Honolulu, if you've been around in the Kalihi neighborhoods and the Laliha neighborhoods, places like that, you'll notice all of those buildings have someone's name over the top. And unless you are a Honolulu historian, you have no idea who those people are. The only one, by the way, that people seem to know is Wo Fat. And that's because he was the bad guy on the original Hawaii Five-0. But everybody else, they look at it and they have no idea. They drive through. Now, when we're driving through, like New York or Washington, D.C., you see certain names, and certain names are still remembered. But so many are not. Salmon P. Chase. Everybody goes, who is that guy? And this is what Solomon is saying. He says, you enjoy your life, but do not make it about things, because the things are all going to be taken away or the things are all going to be lost. Learning from the past and present allows us to plan for the future. And the purpose of that is to not make the same mistakes, but also allowing us to realize that no matter how hard we work or how good we are, we're not guaranteed anything in this life. Remember going back a few chapters where he said that there are these princes who don't deserve the title or the power, and that there are these servants who should be king? And he says, this is a reality. And by the way, remember, this is the king, and this is the guy who the Bible says is the wisest person to ever live. And so when he's saying this, it's also a moment of reflectivity. Because remember, Solomon is talking about this teacher, which is really him, but he's trying to give us that third person, where we walk around talking about ourselves in the third person. Well, we think this, or, and he's trying to get us to understand, but he's also reflecting on the fact that maybe he, at times, doesn't feel qualified to be king. When he thinks about the mistakes he's made, the bad decisions that he made, and he's sitting there and he's saying, nobody is guaranteed anything. He says, God told me, ask for whatever you want, I'll give it to you. And I simply said, give me wisdom. And God says, because you asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you the rest as well. But he says, I didn't deserve it. Verse 9, rejoice, young man, while you are young, and let your heart be glad in the days of your youth, and walk in the ways of your heart, and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all of these things, God will bring you to judgment. If only you could go back and get our young self to listen to our old self. But would our young self listen? There's a bunch of these movies out and books, where somebody gets to time travel and go back in time, but they can't tell themselves straight away because, that would violate all the principles. So they have to find a way to get the young self to understand something without just walking up to them and saying, hey, you're about to be stupid, don't do it. The problem is the reason the young self is so set on doing whatever they're doing is because they actually believe they're going to get away with it, or it's necessary, or it's what they want. At this time of year, of course, A Christmas Carol is the one that we all look at as we go to the past, the present, the future, to see what life would be like, is like, and should be like, or could be like. And this is that struggle that we're into. He says, when you understand who you are, and you understand, I would love to go back and all the things that I did as a kid and a teenager and in my 20s, there are things that I would love to go back and I would say, I knew back then, but we always say, hey, you're only young once. You only live once. But we would love to go back and be able to fix things. But it's interesting because we're not fixing things now for whatever future we still have left. In other words, we want to go back, and what we want is a magic pill to make that right, assuming that, by the way, if we fix that, when we come forward, our life right now is going to be perfect. But there's no guarantee of that either. Even if we fix the thing way back there that we broke, it doesn't mean that today is going to be perfect. Verse 10, remove sorrow from your heart and put away pain from your flesh, because youth and the prime of life are fleeting. We either push through the pain or we let it define us. See, God is not going to let your sin define who you are. He forgave it on the cross. He buried it in the tomb. When Jesus came out of the tomb, he left our sin in that tomb. Your sin no longer defines you in the eyes of God. It may define you in the eyes of the world, but it will not define you in the eyes of God. When we understand that the pain that we're going through, sometimes, by the way, the pain was brought on by us because of things we did. Other times it was brought on by someone else. Sometimes it's a chronic thing that we can't understand or even explain. It just is what it is. And we do have a choice. Now, this doesn't mean that we can simply put it out of our mind and live as though we're not in pain or not suffering or not going through the consequences of previous decisions or actions. But it means that we can either sit and say, oh, woe is me, or we can say, well, I can't do that and I can't do that, but let's find the things that I can do. And Solomon is saying, when he says, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die, his point is, what are you going to do today and what can you do today? Don't say, well, you know what, in 6 weeks, maybe I'll be able to. He says, what can you do today? And then get it done. Insofar as it has to do with you, be at peace with everyone. And that includes God. Eat, drink, and be merry. You've been given a life. Whatever life you've been given, as much as you would love to be able to magically, get into a pumpkin that turns into a carriage and have glass slippers and all of those wonderful fairy tales. The one thing that I learned, by the way, is that when I went to Germany to visit my son about 15 years ago, that was really the first time, by the way, that I understood that the German fairy tales end very differently than our American fairy tales. Whether it's Hansel and Gretel or any of them, they end very, very differently. In America, we decided, primarily a guy named Walt Disney said, hey, we can fix these so you're no longer broken. Problem is, sometimes the fairy tales need to end poorly to remind us that sometimes the glass slipper isn't going to fit. All right, chapter 12, the final words. Like I said, this is where Solomon says, all right, I need to make sure you've been paying attention. I need to make sure that you understand all of this. And he says it all boils down to something very simple. Verse 1, so remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of adversity come, and the years approach when you will say, I have no delight in them. Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way they should go, that when they are old, they will not depart from it. It's much easier to keep a good habit going than it is to try to create a good habit. And the older we get, the harder it is to change the things that we have allowed ourselves to become. And so Solomon is saying, when you are young, and by the way, today you are young, because tomorrow you will not be as young as you were today. So we're not talking 5 years old, 10 years old, 15, 20, 25. We are talking about whatever you are age today. Today you are, bless you, we are younger today than we will be tomorrow. And he says, so begin to plan today so that tomorrow you can do the things. And if you can't do them tomorrow, you got them done today. Verse 2, before the sun and light are darkened and the moon and the stars and the clouds return after the rain. This isn't a weather or sunrise report. This is an Advent passage. This is the keep watch, because you don't know when the master is going to come back. And so he's saying, right now, here's the thing you know. You have this moment and you know what resources you have, and you have no idea what tomorrow's going to be like, what resources. So you understand today. So live today using whatever you have. Verse 3, on the day when the guardians of the house tremble and the strong men stoop, the women who grind cease because they are few, and the ones who watch through the windows see dimly. If you learn when you are young that life is not fair and things don't always work the way we think they should or want them to, it makes life much easier to live. Right now, one of the big things going on in the church is that the church is no longer what it was in the 1950s. When some of my first memories of the church in the 60s, remember I was going to a Baptist church, was that the lady who was my Sunday school teacher took over for her mother, who took over for her grandmother, teaching the same class. The elders, when this elder retired, he turned his position over to his son. There were 100 women who would get together and make blankets or make those little tuna fish sandwiches or the deviled eggs for funerals and things. All of this was the church in the 50s and the 60s and the early 70s. The Lutheran Women Missionary League was a huge organization. And today, here's what we know. A lot of the groups that were huge and doing well in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are not doing well today. Churches have shrunk. There are those that are large, but the average church now worships less than 75, and I'm not talking Lutheran, I'm talking all denominations. It is not what it used to be. And all a lot of churches are doing is trying to reclaim the glory days. And they keep thinking, if we could only do this, then everything will be fine. But the church has changed. COVID changed us hugely. And as much as we would like to just snap our fingers and go back to what we were, today is different than yesterday, and tomorrow will be different than today. I retire in a few years, and I'm very thankful that I have a son-in-law and soon a second son-in-law who will be pastors, but I also pray for them because the church they are inheriting is going to be very, very different than the one that I walked into just 40 years ago when I became a pastor. And Solomon is saying, when we step back and actually take a look at things and just say, hey, what can we be and what can we do with what we have? I don't need to be the Assemblies of God. I don't need to be St. Elizabeth. I don't need to be St. Timothy. I can be our Savior. And it's okay. And the reason it's okay is because the day that God is done with His church, we won't be able to keep it open no matter how much we want. It doesn't matter how much money or how much property or how many people. When God is done with your church, it's done. And Solomon is saying we need to understand that this is His church, not ours. Verse 4, the doors at the streets are shut while the sound of the mill fades. When one rises at the sound of a bird, all the daughters of song grow faint. And this is Solomon getting into his whole Proverbs. And, it's a little bit mysterious and a little bit poetic. It's almost like he's had a little bit too much to drink. And as his words flow, they're taking on an eeriness. The young do not worry as much as the old, because the old know what can happen. Every time I do a wedding and I say, are you guys going to hold on to each other no matter what happens, whether sickness or in health, whether, all this stuff. And when you are 19 years old and getting married, you smile and say, we love each other. It's all going to be fine. When I do weddings for those, and I did a wedding for a couple of 70-year-olds a couple months ago. I said, you guys know what it's like? And they said, yep, because they both lost spouses. One, by the way, lost his spouse. He was flying a small airplane and it crashed and his wife died. He knows what pain is. So they stood there on the beach exchanging vows, and they looked at each other and they said, we know the worst that the world can throw at us. We're still willing to take this step. So the old know what can happen. So even though they cannot hear or see as well, they have an inner sight and hearing as they watch the world. And this is why we honor our kupuna. This is why we go to those, our grandparents and our aunts and uncles, our parents, and we say, we finally get to this point in our life where we say, can you help me understand this? I thought I had it all figured out in my head, but my heart and soul are in turmoil. Can you help me understand some things? Because I think you have a knowledge that I'm not going to have for another 10 or 20 years. Verse 5, also they are afraid of heights and dangers on the road. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper loses its spring, and the caper berry has no effect. For man is headed to his eternal home, and mourners will walk around in the street. The old understand their days are numbered. Remember that beautiful psalm, teach me to number my days aright, O Lord, that I may walk a path of wisdom into your arms. It will either lead them to mourn or to live fully. The day you wake up and there's a whole bunch of candles on your birthday cake, you either say, man, it is great. One of our families walked out of church and it's their anniversary this week. 65 years they've been married. That is one more year than I've been alive. And I look at my life of 64 years and I go, they've been married to each other for that long. That's just amazing. And they are living their life as fully as they can, taking care of one another, dealing with all the things that come with being older. And Solomon says, when we understand who we are, we either look at the days in front of us and are excited, or we look at the days in front of us and we lose them because we're mourning because they aren't what we want, or there aren't as many of them as we wish they were. Verse 6, before the silver cord is snapped and the gold bowl is broken and the jar is shattered at the spring and the wheel is broken into the well, much of our life is a cycle, eating, drinking, sleeping. And unless we find joy in these simple things, our life can be one of pain, misery, and worry. And so when he talks about all these silver and gold things, he's saying this is food, this is work, this is the checkbook, this is all those things. And they just keep going in a circle and in a circle. And he says, once in a while, we get to step outside of that circle. But most of the time, that is life. And this is that moment, there used to be that old song, is this all there is? And you see people, I still remember when my daughter, by the way, when she was in college, and I was back there and I was visiting her, and I said, how are things going? She goes, good. I said, are you starting to figure out what you want to do? And this was where she says, Dad, don't take this personally. But she said, my goal is to not be like you. And I said, okay, I'll try not to take it personally, but explain that. And she said, Dad, you work too much. She said, life should be more about fun. Okay, now she's got 2 children. Now she's married to a pastor. She's been a preschool director, probably going to be a preschool director again. And so now, all these years later, she goes, okay, Dad, it's kind of what life is. And I go, yeah. I said, now, if you can win the lottery, I would love to retire to Maui. But short of you winning the lottery, the Bangles had that old song, where she says, I got to get to work. Otherwise, I guess I'm just not going to get paid. And we're like, yeah, that's one of the problems. I don't want to go to work, but I still want to be paid. Oh. And so Solomon is saying, how is life working? And now that you know, you begin to get into it and you develop a rhythm. Verse 7, and the dust returns to the earth as it once was, and the spirit returns to the God who gave it. Genesis 2:7, and God breathed into man's nostrils the breath of life. Everything else, God just said, let there be. But with man, he actually knelt down and he scooped up the earth and he formed it, and then he breathed life into the nostrils of the man. He breathed the spirit, the pneuma, as we say in the Greek. He breathed it into this man. He gave this man his own breath, his own spirit. Death is inevitable. And when the spirit returns to God who gave it, the only question is, in what form will it return? Heaven or hell? Because those are the only 2 choices. Genesis 3:19, you will eat bread by the sweat of your brow until you return to the ground, since you were taken from it. For you are dust and you will return to dust. This is that saying that we say when we're at the funeral. From dust we came, to dust we shall return. However, not without the sure and certain hope of the resurrection of Jesus Christ that we have in and through him. And so this is where, when we step back, Solomon says, you're going to return to dust. Your spirit's going to return to God. What will happen when that moment takes place? Verse 8, absolute futility, says the teacher. Everything's futile. Remember, this is Solomon in the third person talking about himself, because he says, unless we understand the truth of life, our life is going to be meaningless. What is the difference between imitating someone and following someone? I grew up with Rich Little. Rich Little was an impressionist. He did the most amazing impressions. And if you closed your eyes, you would think that he was Johnny Carson, John Wayne. He could be anybody. And it was absolutely amazing, except the truth was, he wasn't any of those people. In other words, even though he had the voice and the inflections right, he could not walk into a cafe and say, I'm John Wayne, give me a table. They would say, you're not John Wayne. We can see you're not John Wayne. You're not the president. You're not these people. However, I look at Billy Graham. Billy Graham said, my goal in life is to draw close enough to my Savior that I become just even a little bit like him. And when we would see Billy Graham and the way that he acted and the way that he lived and how he took care of people, he made mistakes. There were things he had to be forgiven for. But when he lived his life, people saw him as one who was imitating Jesus and following him, not ever going to become him, but become enough like him that the world would say, we see why this is taking place. Exactly. This is John 1:43. Verse 9, in addition to the teacher being a wise man, he constantly taught the people knowledge. He weighed, explored, and arranged many proverbs. Solomon says, my job in life was to spew wisdom, and I did everything I could. But can you be a leader without followers? If you are the wisest person in the world, but nobody listens to you. This is that old, if a tree falls in the wilderness and nobody's there to hear it, does it make a sound? And that was philosophy class, where we wanted to debate all this stuff. But the truth of the matter is, the tree obviously makes a sound, but with no one there to hear it, it doesn't make an impact anywhere. And so Solomon says, I arranged all these proverbs. I did all this teasing. I came up with these amazing sermons, these amazing thoughts. But he said, very few actually fully understood them and applied them in such a way that it changed their life and thus changed the world. And that's what he's getting to. He's saying, I'm about to wrap up. I'm almost done with this book. You guys have been sitting there for a long time listening. And he says, now, can you see what we're about to do? Verse 10, the teacher sought to find delightful sayings and write words of truth accurately. See, not only did he come up with this wisdom from himself, but he also would walk around. And this is, by the way, Rick Warren used to say this all the time. We'd be at conferences and Rick would say, I just had this great thought. And he says, now here's the thing. You guys all go back to your congregation on Sunday and you can sound brilliant by quoting this. And then he said, creativity is forgetting where you stole it from. But you see, Rick Warren would say, everything that I have is a gift from God. And he told the disciples, Jesus did, give freely, for freely you have been given. So he says, you're free to use whatever I have. So the teacher says, I would go out and I would try to find other people that also had wisdom. This is where I love it. 25 years ago, this guy was in church. He was a normal member at Messiah, but he lived part of the year on the mainland. Occasionally, he'd come to our Savior. And he and I got together one time and we were talking, and I knew that he was a pilot. Actually, he was a flight engineer on the old 727 back in the days when you had to have a pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer. And we were talking one day, and he says, I suppose I should tell you, I was the flight engineer on the D.B. Cooper flight when he jumped out of the back. And all of a sudden, I'm like, Andy, so of course I go back, this is pre-internet, but I looked it up in an encyclopedia, and sure enough, he's listed in there as the flight, and he goes, yeah, that was my flight. And he says, the FBI still checks my bank accounts all the time, wondering where the money went, because they never found DB and they never found the money. And this is a story that I would have never known, except he happened to stumble into church one day, and we were talking. He says, hey, let's go do lunch. And I said, that'd be great. And I was talking to another one of our members. He was in the Pentagon on 9/11. Carried a bunch of bodies out, some alive, some dead. Talked to another guy, and Tom Hermanson, who's right now, I'm watching his dog for him for a couple of days. He's and his wife are on vacation. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated, he was the radio man at McMurdo Station in the South Pole. And he had to wake the CO up because they raised the threat level. And so every time somebody says, where were you when John F. Kennedy died? He wins, okay? He was at the South Pole and had to wake up the CO. And this is one of those things where when you learn that these people have this experience, this knowledge, this beautifulness, and you get to sit at their feet and hear their stories, and then you get to take their stories and retell them to others to make a difference. This is what Solomon is talking about. To speak truthfully requires that you know the subject that you're talking about. Knowing in the Hebrew sense of being one with the subject. The Hebrew word is yada. Yada means I know it so well that I am one with it. And so there are things I know, and there are other things I would like to know, and there are some things that I will never understand. And so I sit at the feet of those who do understand it, and when they explain it to me, I can only get this much of it. But I see that they know the truth, and they explain enough to me that I can go and use a tiny bit of knowledge. Verse 11, the sayings of the wise are like goads, and those who are masters of collections are like firmly embedded nails. The sayings are given by one shepherd. When we hear what we hear, and it's hard to listen to, and yet we also know it's the truth, there is a temptation that we will seek to find someone else to listen to, somebody who agrees with us or we agree with them. In other words, if I hear something and I don't like it, then I just run over here and I find someone else to talk to, and I hear what I want to hear. There can only be one king, one shepherd. This is the challenge of the Hebrew nation when they said, we want a king. And God says, I've given you judges. I am your king. And they go, yeah, but you're in heaven. We want a king on this earth. And we want him to be tall and good looking and strong and this presence. And God says, you don't. And they said, we want one. He says, fine, I'll give you one. But it's not going to be what you think, because there can only be one king. And of course, those kings immediately tried to take God's place. Verse 12. But beyond these, my son, be warned. There is no end to the making of many books, and much study wearies the body. I love this verse. How much do we really need to know? Science, theology, history, art, is there a terminus, an end to it? No. Because no matter how much we learn, there is always something beyond it. There's always something more to experience, something more to try, something more to ask. By the way, that last verse was the verse that I read for my son-in-law a couple months ago at his installation in California. And people laughed. They said, what? And I said, he needs to know that he doesn't have to know everything. Because there are people in the church who already know what needs to be known. And he needs to trust them and learn to rely on them rather than trying to become the expert. John 10:31, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, the Bible. But these are written so that you may believe Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name. We have no idea on the 29th day of Jesus' ministry what he had for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. We have no idea if he ever suffered a cold. We have no idea if he ever got a blister on his foot. We have no idea how many other people that he healed. We only know what we have recorded in the scripture, but we know that if we simply write out a chart and we try to schedule out 365 days a year times 3, we have a very, very small amount of his life. But John says it's enough. It's everything you need in order to know that God loves you and he wants you to be in heaven forever. When all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is, fear God and keep his commands, because this is for all humanity. To know God is to know all that you need to know. That's what faith is about. Something that can only be given by God. It's foolishness to the wise, but to us who are fools for Christ, it is everything we need. And so Solomon steps back and he says, look, I'm talking in the third person about this teacher, who happens to be me. I'm trying to share with you my thoughts, my fears, my worries. But he said the one truth is to fear God. Because, and by the way, this is fear not as being afraid of, but rather to respect with a holiness that can only be found in one thing. And that one thing is everything that you need. And so Solomon gets to the end and he says, so, wrapping it up, fear God. Know that he loves you. Know that he sent a Savior for you. There's a place in heaven with your name on the door. He's just waiting for you to come home. And he says, if you know that, now go out and live, because you no longer have to worry about earning, deserving, all this stuff. You just get to take everything you have and live. Verse 14, for God will bring every act to judgment, including every hidden thing, whether good or evil. It's quite the ending. Think what you will. God wins. So if you want to win, you find a way to be drawn near to God. Because as I love to be reminded of, when I'm with somebody who has authority, I can go anywhere, because if I'm with them, all they say is, he's with me, and we walk through any door. And if I'm with Jesus, when I get to heaven, nobody at the pearly gates is going to stop when somebody points and says, hey, he's with Jesus, let him in. Same goes for you. That's what Solomon is trying to say. All right, hope you enjoyed the book of Ecclesiastes. Next week, because it is the 22nd and the week before Christmas, and then, by the way, we're taking 2 weeks off. No, 1 week off, sorry. We're going to be taking the Sunday after Christmas. No, we're not. I don't know what I'm talking about. Christmas is in the middle of the week this time. We will have Bible class next Sunday and the Sunday after. Yep. Next Sunday, we're going to do a one-time on the Christmas story. And then the week after, we're going to do something on the wise men. And the week after that, we're going to do something also. We're going to do 3 weeks on the Christmas theme, leading us up to Epiphany. Go in peace and serve the Lord in gladness.